In the last video, we talked about Mexican Texas. About 1821, Mexico gains its independence from Spain and the political factions that begin to form, Centralists versus the Federalists, and what kind of effect that had on Texas itself. Okay, we also talked about another event that was happening around the world that also had a great event on Texas, and that was the growth of cotton in the United States. And so that's where we're really leading to. Now we're going to talk about the colonization plans that begin to come out. Okay, so just like I mentioned before, Texas really wanted to have new settlement occur. And at that time, even before the Constitution of 1824, Mexican Texas actually did put a plan in place through something called empresarios, in which those are people that are given contracts by the government in order to form colonies or settlements, right? And with this, they get a certain amount of land in a certain place, and they're allowed to give their settlers, attract them with different types of land in order to come settle the area, okay? And the first successful empresario of Texas was Stephen F. Austin. This was actually interesting. His father's brainchild, what his father came up with. His father wrote to Stephen, who was in Louisiana, I believe, at the time, and he wrote to him and said, "Hey, this is what I want to do. This is want to grow in Texas," and he has this big plan for a colony. So Stephen comes out to help his dad, and unfortunately, his dad dies. Okay, but Stephen's going to carry the torch and try to help his dad. So he goes back to Louisiana to go gain some more colonists. And he comes back in 1822 with colonists, and there's a new government, okay? And so he's actually told he needs to go to Spain, or to Mexico City, not Spain, in order to get permission for the colony. And he actually gets more than he even expected when he goes to get this authorization to settle, okay? Now, there are a few stipulations. They want to have Catholic immigrants. That's not going to happen if you bring people in from the United States. And so that means that people would have to convert. Another thing is, he got up to 200 families that he could bring. And each family, get this, we get over 4,000 acres if they did ranching. And then they got like 177 if they did farming. But people lied and said they did stock raising even when they didn't. That was very common. Impresarios, for all their trouble of gaining colonists to come, would get premium land once they could reach 200 families. Regarding the issue of slavery, and this is going to become an issue a little bit later on, settlers could bring their slaves, but they couldn't get more slaves. There could be no slave trade within Texas. And if any slaves are born on Texas soil, they would get their freedom after the age of 14. And so we know that people shirk this, that there were ways around it, that they didn't really do this and really honor this. And this also becomes a sticking point for the government in Mexico, okay? But let's talk about Austin's colony in particular. He is actually going to be the only one under the Imperial Colonization Law of 1823 to fulfill his impresario contract in full in Texas. By 1827, Austin had actually reached 297 families. This is what he referred to as the Old 300. And just to put this in perspective, how many of those families had slaves? 69 of the families had slaves, which was about 25% of the entire population. About 1,800 people in Texas in the first colony were slaves. Also, Austin ran his government from a new town called San Felipe de Austin, which today we know as Austin. It will also be the first one in Texas to have its own militia, okay? So this gives you an idea of Austin's colony in particular. Let me see if I can show right here this is his first area that he created, and over here is his colony. The other pink areas are going to be areas that he settles a little bit later on as well. So that kind of gives you an idea. Oh, and by the way, this is the state of Coahuila in Texas, right? So Coahuila is down here, and Texas is up here, of course. Okay, so some other colonies besides Austin's that begin to use this contract. So there were two laws. There was a law that comes out of it was really because of the Federalist government The state of Coahuila and Texas developed their own state colonization law in 1825. And in this, they said there would be the governor would actually have a commissioner oversee these colonies, settlement, said you can't dispose of them in 6 years. And this was really in an effort to not get people to buy land and dispose of them quickly, like almost like a flip, right? But some significant other impresarios besides Austin was Green DeWitt, and of course DeWitt County is named after him. He actually settled an area that was really close to Austin's colony, probably in the Bernie, Kerrville, Fredericksburg area, probably most likely. But there was a major Indian attack, and he actually moved it to in the southeast part of San Antonio de Bexar, and that is the town of Gonzales, right? The come and take it flag. We'll talk about that a little later on. Martin de Leon is the first Mexican impresario that comes up successfully to settle in Texas, and he establishes the town of Victoria. Now, this becomes a very successful ranching community. Okay, and so this is a map that really shows you this area, right? So you can see Austin's original colony here, and then later on he's going to establish more. This was actually an Irish colony, De Leon here, Zavala a little later on. So we have a lot of Tejano elites, so you can kind of see how this developed. All right, so things didn't go as well, and one thing to really know about these the impresario contracts is most of them were not fulfilled. Okay, most of the people weren't really successful. I showed you a map there of the times when they were successful. But one of the things that happens is that you get a lot of not really nice impresarios, and one of those people was a man named Hayden Edwards. Okay, so this is him right here, and Hayden Edwards and his brother get an impresario contract in 1825. Okay, they get a contract near Nacogdoches, and there's already a mix of people there. People that had got Spanish colonization contracts, land grants, Cherokees that were actually given permission that after 1820, some of them got permission to live in the land there. They moved from like the Georgia area to there. You also had squatters. So almost immediately, Hayden becomes like very dictatorial. He issues an ultimatum. He says, you better show me your land grant or a valid title, or you have to pay me for the land if you want it. And when he also came there, in order of just being a total jerk, he also held rigged elections, right? In which he said he had an alcalde, which was like a city council, but it was really rigged to have I think it was his son-in-law or his brother-in-law or somebody like that, to, be the person that was the alcalde instead of the person that was actually elected. But the political chief of the Texas region was actually overturned that, and President Victoria, the person that was president of Mexico at that time, was so disturbed by Edwards' behavior and reports of his behavior that he orders him out of Mexico, okay? And he's not going to go quietly. He resists, actually writes his own Declaration of Independence of the Republic of Fredonia, which is why this is called the Fredonian Rebellion. Stephen F. Austin and others, Erasmo Seguin and other people, they rally and to try to get this guy out because they think he's awful, and they actually help get him out. Now, originally, the Cherokee thought that Fredonia was going to be a real thing, and they first sided with Hayden Edwards, but then they changed sides and helped the Mexicans and the Texans. Okay. Edwards, he flees with his brother. They go back to Louisiana. But what this shows the Mexican government is a couple things. Number one, Stephen F. Austin can be trusted, right? Like he's good. He's a good guy. He has the best interest of Mexico at heart. Another thing is that not all indigenous people are hopeless. Like they said, hey, the Cherokee, helped us out with this. And so it shows them that, and then it shows that that there are people that are loyal in Texas. There are some people that are not, like obviously Hayden Edwards, but there are Anglos that actually have the best interest of them at heart. So some people say, "Oh, this was the first rebellion." Well, the people that led the rebellion later on didn't support the Fredonia and all that stuff like that. So that's important to think about. Okay. What was happening with Indians at this time? Okay. Our different indigenous groups. Which indigenous group mattered on and what exactly was happening to them at the time. The first group was the Karankawas. This group, Stephen F. Austin wrote pretty horrible things about them. So there's absolutely no way of subduing them but through extermination. He actually orders them out. They moved west of Lavaca. They agreed to move west of Lavaca, but there was absolutely nothing there. Many of them died from disease and hunger, and many of them resorted to resuming raids because of that. Okay. The Takawas were actually considered a non-threat, and the people of Texas as settlers used them as a barrier between the Comanche and the Apache groups and Wichitas and other groups like horse tribes that were pretty violent groups. And the two groups that were most feared were, of course, the Comanche and Apache. The Comanche and Apache are absolutely sworn enemies, okay? And in a much different way than they behaved before this. Remember, the Spanish actually made a treaty and gave Comancheria to the Comanche. The Mexicans actually make a treaty with the Lipan Apaches, which were the sworn enemies of the Comanche. And with this, they teamed up with the Mexicans and the Texans to launch a series of Comanche raids and to try to, drive the Comanches out. A massive Comanche raid. And so with this, they really do create this raid. In 1826, the Wichitas, there was a large militia raid against them as well. They retaliated with raids in San Antonio and in Gonzales. Okay, there is going to be an Indian agent by the name of Peter Bean. He comes in a little later on, and he actually tries to help and stop some of these raids. And makes a lot of successful peace treaties with a lot of the Native American groups. Okay, what was life like really in Mexican Texas at the time? There was definitely a decline in agriculture and ranching with all the instability that was happening in Mexico. San Antonio and La Bahia, which is later on Gonzales, they are growing, but at a really slow rate. Victoria is actually the one that grows exponentially, especially with ranching. It was pretty lonely, secluded life. And what we begin to see is that Anglos are going to begin to outnumber Tejanos by a number of 2 to 1. So they're not getting a lot of people from Mexico that are willing to migrate into Texas or from other countries for that matter. Most of the people that are arriving in Texas at this time are Anglos. Okay. All right. So we're going to kind of teeter back over here and talk about the growing tension and instability in Mexico at this time. The Tejanos, believe it or not, there were many Tejanos that were upset about the fact that they become outnumbered at this time. They actually asked for some sort of a rational, enforceable immigration policy. They said the Anglos were coming in, they were wanting to speak English only, they're refusing to assimilate. Very different than what we hear today, right? There is somebody named General Manuel Mir y Terán in 1827, and this is him here, and he was a really important person that does an expedition of Texas. And he writes this report, and he's like, hey, I think we need to be paying attention to what's happening here in Texas. He says the government needs to take steps to try to stop an Anglo takeover. He actually warns that the U.S. is probably going to take over Texas. He said we need to stop Texans from coming. We need to encourage more Mexican and European migrants from coming. And so that is happening, right? In addition to that, there is a lot of turmoil and turnover in the Mexican presidency in itself. Guadalupe Victoria was there for a while. He's the only president to be in without any kind of military intervention. Vicente Guerrero, he only serves a year as president, and then a centralist takeover happens. Anastasio Bustamante, he overthrows Guerrero, and so now you have a new centralist government. So a lot of things are happening that causes quite a bit of instability. Okay, because of Manuel y Terán's report and the new centralist government that takes over, they issue the Law of 1830. This basically avoided all impresario contracts. It banned slavery completely, the importation of any slaves, and it didn't want anybody from the U.S. to immigrate into Texas. They could immigrate into other areas of Mexico, but not to Texas, okay? And this law is really going to be the launching pad for a lot of friction in Texas, okay? Slavery in Texas at that time, also happening towards the end of 1830. Mexico outlaws slavery at all, okay? But even with this outlawing of slavery, Austin and others kind of negotiate for a loophole to say, oh, well, okay, they won't be slaves. We'll give them indentured servant contracts. So, they kind of create a loophole at the time. But you have to understand that at this time, Afro-Americans were really considered full members of Mexican society. And the President Guerrero at the time, he was actually of mixed ancestry. And the law of 1830 specifically forbade, slavery in Texas, right? It forbids the importation of it. And so this becomes a growing concern of Texans. In addition to that, there are some large disturbances called the Anahook disturbances in Texas at this time. So a commander named John Davis Bradburn, he is appointed the garrison commander, and this is in Anahook. This is along the coast, kind of by Corpus Christi to Houston type of area. But anyway, he was there to stop any kind of smuggling and that was occurring. There was quite a bit of smuggling that was happening. One of the smugglers was a guy named William Barrett Travis and a guy named Patrick Jack. They tried to create a citizens militia, but they get caught. And they get thrown in prison. And because of them getting thrown in prison and because of the presence of this military here trying to stop smuggling and other things like happening, there's a Turtle Bayou uprising that happens in this area. And they rose up and they win. They actually kick out the group, okay? They support the Federalist cause. They supported Santa Anna. They supported the restoration of the Constitution of 1824 in that Turtle Bayou Resolution. There was also the Battle of Nacogdoches in 1832. And what happens with this is they essentially kick out Mexican officials out of East Texas, and they're not going to make their way back in. Now, one thing to think about, too, is that not all settlers did want to rise up against the Mexican government, but many did. And the Tejano elite, the Anglos, they definitely were firm Federalists. And they developed, there's two conventions, one in 1832 and one in 1833, in which they petitioned specific things against the law of 1830. Austin takes this petition on his own and goes down to Mexico City to negotiate. Okay, and we'll talk about the outcome here in just a minute about that. But in 1835, I just want to put this in perspective, even with these restrictive laws happening, 30,000 new U.S. settlers arrived in Texas, 5,000 more slaves. So even with all of these laws to try to stop them from coming in, they were still coming in droves. Anglo settlers were with their slaves. Okay, so Santa Anna actually does win the next election and wins the next reform with a revolt, and he becomes president. He reinstated the impresario contracts, and he allowed the resumption of U.S. Immigrants to come in. He allowed English to become the official language, and he actually created a court system. So most Texans were really happy with these newest reforms. But Austin writes a letter back home and says, yeah, you know what, I'm happy about this. Like, this is good, but we're still stuck being part of Coahuila. And this letter gets intercepted. And some government officials are really upset about this, when he did this. So they arrest Austin and they put him in prison. He's not in there very long, but he ends up having to remain in Mexico City while there's all this turmoil between the Centralists and the Federalists, and he doesn't go back up until 1835. And by that time, Austin gets up there in 1835. He's like, we can't work with the Mexican government anymore. So even though Austin had supported the Mexican government for quite a while, he comes to the realization that there wasn't any way that they were going to be able to work with them, okay? The other thing that happens that really is the final tipping point was the Centralist resurgence that happens in Mexico City. And Santa Anna begins to dismantle the reforms himself. There's a lot of chaos. Even though he had his vice president actually running the country, he comes back and he actually becomes more of a centralist. He comes in, he kicks out the vice president, puts a new vice president in. He closed down Congress. He says he has to. It's an emergency situation. He fired his cabinet. And a lot of Federalists really resist this. Obviously, the Federalists in Texas do, okay? In addition to this, the governor of Coahuila in Texas is arrested. Still, most settlers wanted to figure out how to adjust and not resist. But either way, Austin was out. He encouraged settlement. And by September of 1835, Texas was ready for revolt. And that's where we're going to leave it, because in the next one, we're going to talk about the Texas Revolution.